name is Esther Wamboi Kimani. I am the founder of an organization called Zamara Foundation, which is a feminist homegrown organization that I founded in 2016. Zamara Foundation is anchored on radical, bold perspectives on bodily autonomy and integrity, intersectional feminist leadership for young women and girls. And we ensure that then young women, we build their capacity so that then they can have a strong voice that speaks to sexual reproductive health and rights, and also our focus to ensure that there's inclusion, to include, those women and girls in all their diversity, especially those that are marginalized. So as I mentioned before, we are very excited to have been able to convene this conversation about African culture. And, we've had this term all the time. Every time you are able to speak about issues to do with sexual reproductive health and rights, all the time someone says that is an African. So when it comes to sexuality, African culture for centuries has been viewed as conservative and that there's no indigenous knowledge on sexuality. However, we have seen in the last few years, we have really experienced a lot of anti-gender rhetoric that is fueled by that argument that, abortion rights, LGBTI, and surrogacy are against African culture. But then again, we have to ask ourselves, what is African culture? And is African culture homogeneous? What is it exactly? Secondly, when we start to really unpack and interrogate African culture, which I hope Professor and Charles Timuga will help us with that today. Our diverse culture, has it always been oppressive to women? We have seen, how cultures has in the current 21st century that has been, oppressive, and it is constantly perpetuated by gatekeepers who, within the community. But then we need to also ask ourselves, was this culture really oppressive to women and girls before, historically, when you think about it? Was it, as we see it today? So, and even to just ask ourselves, when we're discussing sexual reproductive health and rights, where does culture place women's sexual reproductive health and rights in terms of maybe accessing contraceptives? Has it been, has the culture treated us the way it's treating us now, historically? So I'm hoping that, we are going to also learn that. And maybe lastly, I want us to also think back in the last 20 years and see, and just even ask ourselves questions like, who really holds the knowledge? Who is the gatekeeper of this knowledge? Because culture is also about knowledge. Why is it that all of a sudden now we hear LGBTI rights, access to safe and legal abortion, contraceptives, surrogacy is deemed to be an African or ungodly? If history does tell us, and will show us today, putting all this burden to you, Prof, that, didn't our culture really, celebrate us many years ago? And also just the question around where does then Christianity and religion really plays, or, a role in terms of perpetuating this notion of SRHR, sexual reproductive health and rights, being, an African. Just to give an example, in Kenya, and I'll use Kenya because I'm from Kenya. Before, wife inheritance in Kenya, people have, used it to discriminate and oppress women. Historically, we know when you read the books that it was not really oppressive. It was to protect women, to their right to matrimonial property, to ensure that their kids and children are able to inherit that. But we have experienced the same culture, how it has evolved and became impressive. So then what is the role of patriarchy, religion, Christianity, when it comes to perpetuation of these cultures that used to be good culture, but now they are oppressive to women? So that's my third question. And I'm hoping that, we will be able to get response. And finally, with these opening remarks that, maybe I've shared more questions than answers, I know that this conversation is going to unpack culture and enlighten us. And I'm hoping that we are going to get more answers to these questions. And I will end my remarks, so now when I was reading more about culture, I came across, I think it's called Bennett. And one quote in his literature around customary law in South Africa that really caught my eye said that culture is no longer viewed as a set of norms evolving from a homogeneous social group. Instead, it is taken to be repertoire of associated practices and discourses that individuals generate through disputes over signs and meaning. Culture should not be understood to be historic, not static, interdetermined, not bounded, contested, not consensual. And for me, really, this means that then culture is not static. Culture evolves, and we should be able to also use this culture to see how has culture over the years been able to really progress the sexual reproductive health and rights for women and girls. And I'm hoping that this webinar open our eyes and we see how we can actually be able to use the African culture, if it does exist, to continue, advancing the women's rights, especially on SRHR. Thank you very much. I would want to welcome our moderator of the day, Mrs. Tabitha Saoyo, who is a feminist human rights lawyer and currently a PhD fellow at Cardiff University.
Thank you so much, Esther. Ladies, gentlemen from everywhere around the globe, thank you so much for joining us. Allow me to begin by just introducing myself. My name is Saoyo Tabitha Griffith, in the words of Lorna Iglin, who wrote the book, A Girl of Two Worlds. I could perhaps start by saying, I am perfectly what you'd call a girl of two worlds. On one end, I am the daughter of an American father. I was to describe my American father, I would say that perhaps the coolest thing is that I got to shake my father's hand and I got to do many things, including wear what my mama calls ragged torn jeans without any questions from him. From my father's end, he was quite comfortable with me calling him and addressing him by his own name, which is John Milton Griffith. But on the other end, I am also the daughter of a Maasai woman who perhaps if I ever addressed her by her name, Joyce Naeku Saoyo, I'd probably be dead by now. I come from a Maasai culture where I probably do not even know how my uncle's hands feel because based on our culture, I have every time that I'm greeting them to bow down, receive my spit on my head and a blessing. What we have here today is not a conversation around whether I should be wearing ragged jeans or torn jeans, as my mom calls it, or whether I should be bowing down, but it's a conversation around unpacking African culture, if indeed there is something known as African culture. Enough about me. My job today is to moderate this conversation and to introduce two fantastic people that I've had the pleasure of knowing during my lifetime in activism. Our first speaker is Professor Charles Ngwena. Professor Ngwena is what you'd call an academic activist. I label him this way because he's a professor of law at the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria. He has a huge, vast teaching career that spans over 30 decades, 3 decades rather, that is 30 years. And he has taught in schools in many countries across the globe, including Swaziland, South Africa, United Kingdom, the US, Canada, etc. Professor Ngwena has published at the intersection of health, human rights, as well as disability law. He is part of a movement that serves both in the academic, but also resourcing the field in terms of unpacking issues to do with disability rights, race, and culture. I cannot do enough justice in the 5 minutes that I have to introduce him and all the spaces that he sits in. I want him to just take it away from here and give us a glimpse into what is Africanness and what is it that we need to unpack in terms of where we are on sexual and reproductive rights of women. Prof, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for the great honor of the invitation. My understanding is that this is a conversation, and the last thing you want to do in a conversation is to give a lecture. What you want to do is to engage with others so that we share knowledge about what it is to be African. And what is interesting is that if we just recall what Esther Wambui said, in particular, her last quotation, where she quoted Professor Bennett, I think she has answered the question, because what came through from what Professor Bennett was saying was that culture is never static, it's contested at any given point in time. So yes, it is possible to see homogeneities within culture, but at the same time, those homogeneities cannot obscure the differences within culture. They cannot obscure the contestation within culture. And it was also to my advantage that Saoyo spoke about a heritage as a heritage which is in part American and in part Maasai. Again, underlying the dangers of a homogeneous narrative when we think of Africa, when we think of Africanness. So what I'm going to do, I was given a set of questions to answer. And those questions began by asking me whether African culture was homogeneous. And they ended by asking me to apply the concept of African culture to sexual and reproductive health and rights. So what I thought I would do, so that I don't turn it into a question and answer session, I want to share with you what I would regard as the hermeneutics of Africanness. In other words, I've thought about a theoretical approach for answering all those questions. Instead of individually, I'm going to try and answer them through a method which I call the hermeneutics of Africanness. So what I want to do is to persuade you. I hope you can see my presentation. Yeah, so what I want to do is to think about answering this question through highlighting two things about identity, which is that when we think of identity, we basically can think of identity as essential, as homogeneous, where we identify a particular core character of identity. And I would like to persuade you that we don't have such an identity, because the identities we have come out of social construction. They are not essential identities. So yes, we are able to find similarities, but we are also able to find differences. We are able to ask the person what they think about themselves and who they think they are, but we also ask others what they think about them. So identity can be a process of self-identification, but very often it is a mixture of how you identify yourself and how others identify you. This is not a new question. It has been debated by some of our leading thinkers, and one important debate took place about 30 years ago between Ali Mazrui and Wally Soyinka, because they differed in their understanding of what is Africanness and who is African. We can go to the next slide. So we can think of answering this question by really going back, Saoyo was saying, about her own identity and her own mixed heritage, that is having a father who is American and a mother who is Maasai. So we can ask the question, who are Africans? Are they a racial community? Are they a cultural community? Are they a religious community? Or are they a linguistic community? Are they a political community? Or a combination of all these? And I think you'll agree with me that actually, at a given point in time, we might be speaking across purposes. Some might think of African culture as tied to racial identity. And if they do so, then they are likely to exclude a very large segment of the population who identify as African, but are not identified by others as African. So the point I am making is that identity does not totally depend on the outsider. Ultimately, what is crucial is how the person identify themselves. If we think of Africa, we really can't say we are a linguistic community because that is not true. We speak so many different languages across the 54 or 55 African states. So we can never claim Africanness through language. And yet, at a country level or at a regional level, you may, of course, be able to claim Africanness through language. For those who are part of the East African community, for example, where Swahili is a lingua franca, they are able to assert their cultural homogeneity in part through language. But this does really not apply to the balance of Africa. If you look at Southern Africa, we do not have a common language as such. And English, if you like, is our lingua franca. So are we not Africans? Yes, we are Africans, and yet we subscribe to different languages. We can say the same about religion because we are a multi-religious continent or region. So those answers, I think, are not contestable. I don't think you can try to overdo homogeneity when it comes to African identity. In my view, Africanness is really the archetype of a very complex identity and a very diverse identity. What connects us on the African continent is a very good question. Clearly, our historical background, the legacy of colonialism in particular, is what really connects us as Africans, in my view, much more than the racial component. The racial component becomes important through the experience of racial discrimination. So it is not important in itself, but it is a way of organizing ourselves against or along solidaristic lines because we have experienced the legacy of color discrimination. You can ask the question, do all peoples of Africa identify as Africans? And I think you know the answer, that not all people on the African continent will necessarily identify themselves as African. And a very interesting question, in my view, is this: when did Africans become Africans? When did they become conscious of this identity? And the short answer to this is that the term Africa itself was really a historical concept that came from outside. It was a way of understanding imperialism and colonialism and its conquest of a particular region. So the naming of Africans did not start as self-naming. It was very much ascribed naming. But over time, the people of the continent have appropriated that meaning. And my argument is that when they appropriate the meaning, they do so in complex ways. Some do it in a racial sense, others do it through religion, others do it through language. So there are many ways of thinking about our heritage without necessarily assuming that it should lead to sameness. Go to the next slide. So I can sum up what I'm saying by quoting the work of an African historian, Zeleza, who said that the idea of Africa is a complex one with multiple genealogies and meanings, so that extrapolations of African culture, identity, or nationality in the singular or plural, any extrapolation of what makes Africa African is quite slippery, as these notions tend to swing unsteadily between the poles of essentialism and contingency. So, describing and defining Africa and all tropes prefixed by its problematic commandments and engaging in discourses about Africa, the paradigms and politics through which the idea of Africa has been constructed and consumed, and sometimes celebrated and condemned. So that is really it. If we were trying to answer the question, is Africa a homogeneous continent? Are Africans a homogeneous people? The answer is really what the historian Zeleza is telling us. It is really a complex and a multiple genealogy that we partake of as we describe ourselves as Africa and as we describe ourselves as Africans. So in other words, my brothers and sisters, identities are complex formations, and so is African identity, and so is African culture. Within that identity, we can find arguments for suggesting that there is something homogeneous about being African. At the same time, we can find also that identity is socially constructed such that being African is not a static phenomenon. Rather, it's becoming and being. It is really identity always in the process of making. So when we think about African culture, we can think about African culture along the axis of similarity and continuity. And that's how you recognize, if you like, your fellow beings as Kenyans, because there is something that you see that marks Kenyans. And at an ethnic level, that is how you will be able to say, I am Maasai, because you see certain strands of similarity and continuity within that identity. But we should hasten to add that if you look at any identity, there are also axes of difference and rupture. There are also axes of difference and rupture. And what Sayoyo was really makes that point, that there is also difference within culture. There is also rupture within culture, because there you have someone who is African, and yet she has a father who is American and a mother who is Maasai. So I won't ask Saoyo how she describes herself, because she has told us actually how she describes herself. She comes from multiple ancestries. It's not a homogeneous ancestry, but it is a multiple ancestry. And that's really what the continent is made up of. It is made up of features that exhibit a doubleness of similarity as well as differences. And ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, when it comes to identity, it is about positionality. It is what is asserted by either a group in society. It can be a minority group, but very often it is a very dominant group, because linked to claims about culture is power. Those who have power in society are able to assert their view of culture as the only culture. And those who do not have power in society are marginalized and find it difficult to argue that they too share an African identity. And that's exactly what we experience when people assert sexualities that are not heteronormative because of because of the dominance of patriarchy. It is almost given that if you dissent from heteronormativity, then you constitute a minority. You are a threat to the existence, at least that is the perception. You are a threat to the existence of a particular culture that is made from a history of the dominance of men and the dominance of heterosexuality. So that explains, if you like, intersex, if you like, same sex, transgender. We are basically grappling with a heteronormative culture that translates into binary congruence when it comes to the male and female gender. The male sex and the female sex are translated into congruent genders, which are female gender and the male gender. And anything that does not subscribe to that binary experiences discrimination. It experiences danger. And that's why a human rights framework becomes important, not because it is trying to introduce something alien to us, but it is simply trying to remind us how diverse society is. It is reminding us how important it is ultimately not to preoccupy ourselves, but by what constitutes African identity, but by what constitutes respect of human dignity. So what I tried to do on this slide was really to illustrate that the question I was asked was not new. It had been debated by two intellectual giants on the continent, the late Ali Mazrui and the Nobel laureate Wole Soyinka. Now, the background to this debate was that Ali Mazrui had made a documentary. The documentary was called The Africans, a triple heritage. And when introducing this documentary, Ali Mazrui posited that African culture was made from three main strands. One strand was African indigenous values, the other strand was Christianity, and the other strand was Islam. Now, Wole Soyinka disagreed strongly with Mazrui. He thought this was a misrepresentation. And his point was that what Ali Mazrui had done was not to make a documentary about Africans, but about something else. So he was asking Ali Mazrui to say that what you have done is to misrepresent African culture because you didn't make a documentary from a Black African perspective. And the point about what Shoyinka was saying was that this is a view also shared by some Africans. They do see African identity in terms of a particular racialized identity. And the implication of that racialization is that it leaves out a very significant population of persons who regard themselves as Africans and are indeed African. So the point is, being African is actually about belonging to Africa. It's nothing more than that. Here I'm trying to put across the argument that identities, whatever they are, whether they are religious, whether they are cultural, whether they are sexual, they are really an explanation of how people are in relation to other groups. So at the end of the day, African identity is really not a thing in itself. There is no immutable identity called African. Being African is an identity only in relation to something else. And we can ask how Africans have become Africans. And I try to suggest to you that there are a number of explanations, but the most persuasive explanation is that it is really our common experience of living on the African continent and being at the receiving end of colonialism that made us aware of our identity as Africans. Sometimes we're very conscious of it, and at times we are not so conscious of it. But at the end of the day, my argument is that the question posed to me cannot be answered in a dogmatic way. It can be answered by conceding that African identity is complex. And whenever something is complex, it also has the capacity to carry conflict with it. And we know that from time to time, African identity is contested. When women are seeking termination of pregnancy, they are in fact contesting a male vision of what to be African is, or at least in dominant masculine African culture, there is an assumption that women are there to serve the interests of males, and part of how they serve the interests of males is to deprive them of the decision to decide about their own reproductive capacity. So it is really a non-question. We can never imagine a culture which recognizes that only men have a say and women are subordinate. If we recognize that as a fact, then we succeed in reducing women to become reproductive instruments who serve society. Equally, if we only concede that there is one type of sexuality and it is heterosexuality, we are erasing a good component of our African population. A question can be asked historically, did we have these social groups? Did we have women who wanted to terminate pregnancy? Did we have persons of different sexualities or same-sex sexualities? Did we have intersex persons? Did we have transgender persons? Anthropological evidence suggests that, yes, we've always had people that are diverse on the continent, but the naming, of course, was not always known. It was really very often acknowledging in silence. In particular, there are many parts of the continent that do not name same-sex explicitly. Equally, you will find there are many ethnic groups that have names for same-sex sexualities. And in any case, in the age of globalization, people have become to use names that have migrated from other parts of the continent in order, of course, to identify with the cause of freedom. So we should be less concerned about the names that they use. We should be more concerned about whether their human dignity is protected. And at the end of the day, whether you're African, whether you're something else, what really matters about identity, any identity, is whether we are fully respectful of human dignity. So I'd like to end there. Thank you.
Prof. Ngwena acknowledging to us in terms of that identity does not necessarily depend on the outsider, right? And if I got this right, that it's difficult for us as Africans to claim that we're Africans based on language, based on religion, based on politics, because there's a difference in terms of our religion, our languages, our politics, all across the 54 countries, right? And what we're hearing from Prof equally is that perhaps some of the things that give diversity are also equally the things that give connection. That there are people in Uganda across the border who speak Luo, and there are people who speak Luo in Kenya. And therefore, there are connections that happen, not necessarily, within the boundaries of countries, but also outside those countries. And the last thing that we, heard from Prof, as a good student, I must reiterate, is that there's a lot of complexity and there's no one sole answer in terms of that conversation on Africanness and is African culture homogeneous? That's where Prof has taken us in unpacking that whole clapback that we constantly hear from anti-gender groups, that it is against African culture. For those who were there when we started, I began by saying that I am a girl of two worlds, born to an American father and a Maasai mother. It gets more complex because when we get down to my roots, you would imagine instantly that then I should be able to speak Maasai quite fluently. This is very unfortunate for me to say, but I speak Kikuyu, I speak Kamba, I speak Swahili. I probably have 10 words of Maasai in my dictionary, which then goes again to the question that Prof asked on how do you identify? In unpacking the Kenyan part of this, I have the pleasure of introducing our next panelist, who happens again to be a good friend of mine. Dr. Charles Muge, a social scientist, a lateral thinker, a political strategist, going back to the Kenyan context, having heard from Professor Charles Ngwena, how do we unpack culture in Kenya, Uncle Muge? The floor is yours.
Now, back to this topic of African culture. The thing that struck me about culture as I was refreshing my mind on this subject and reading about it was that everything that we discuss regarding culture revolves around human survival. And the packaging of norms, beliefs, ways of going about things that enable a community to, in as a consensus, determine how it is they want to go about their everyday life. Now, one of the things about culture and what makes it dynamic is not just time and change, but interaction with other human beings. Now, this can be voluntary, as in communities moving from one place to the other and trading, or as Professor Gweda mentioned, colonialism or warfare. We didn't need the white man to come and introduce the concept of colonialism. We had it because we had, in our own African setting, communities that dominated others. And the thing about domination is that people then go about doing what they think or they have experienced and they've evolved as best for them. And they now want to ensure and entrench it in other people's lives. Now, if you think about this carefully, this is actually, in my mind, a unified world theory on how it is culture plays an important role in our determining our own significance. Professor mentioned our identity, but that's significance, our significance, and not just significance in isolation, but significance in relation to other people. Why colonialism is a thorn is that it was dominance in a way that I think we had never experienced it, but we sometimes forget that the colonialists had practiced this in their own lands. They had dominated each other back and forth. And by the time they were coming to our continent, they were fairly well practiced. They had been at this thing for quite some time. Like, how many people actually know that this language that we're speaking, the English language, is actually a Germanic language? Many people don't. But it's because of the mixture and people dominating and coming in and going out and doing all sorts of things that brings about this mixture. Look at the Kiswahili language. What do you think it's all about? It's about cultures mixing voluntarily, some not so, but at the end of the day, a commonality is found so that people can get along with their lives. And language is one medium by which you can get along very, very well. One of the things that Tabitha mentioned regarding the work that we did about female inheritance, widow inheritance, and everything that went with it, again, it would not be a subject of conversation or of serious conversation if there wasn't an adverse aspect to it. Widow inheritance was a societal norm practice among the community I come from, the Luos. It was primarily to ensure that the family of the deceased man were looked after, to put it really very simply. And in many cases, if the wife was young, the understanding was that so that the wife would not feel that they needed to move away from that family in order to have their children taken care of. So the children found a community within which they could exist. If you ask people who understand that culture, they'll tell you that young women were always encouraged to be on very good terms with their brothers-in-law, their cousins-in-law, if there's such a term, for the simple reason that it was understood. Look at the concept of a rite of passage. At the heart of many discussions right now in this country, when we talk about GBV, and then we look at the female genital mutilations, if you look back into our history, a lot of these things were rites of passage. And why were they rites of passage? Was it a rite of passage in which the perspective of women was considered, or is it just because it was male dominated and what they said is what went? Understanding that comes about as a result of knowledge that comes about as a result of formal learning or informal learning, but simply expanding your worldview and your understanding, also teaches you that the very things that you do, others may have done it, but have come to understand that there are better ways of going about the same matter. And in so doing, you then seek to have change, but then you meet a very, very concrete wall, and that is the concrete of resistance that human beings have when it comes to change. People resist change, not because it's good or bad, it's because it's change. If you look at many African societies, and I'm talking historically and anthropologically, the position of women was very clear because the roles were clear. There wasn't ambiguity. But with time, when again, we had a situation where we introduced and infused into our systems other things and ways of doing things, what happens then is that we lack the clarity that was previously there in a time when that clarity may not necessarily be as relevant as it once was. So we talk about change. We talk about change. And in this country, one of the changes that we keep talking about is change that is brought about by education. The idea and the notion of the education of the girl child has dominated the conversation in this country, Kenya, for so long that the conversation that is now apparently beginning to gain a little more momentum is the education of the boy child, because somewhere along the line in educating the girl child, the boy child got left behind. And how do you see this? You look at this country. The other day in our talk show, we're looking at some of the women in Kenya who have positions of authority. We have a female chief justice. She's not chief justice because she's female. No. She's chief justice because she's qualified. But because she's female, it stands out because we've never had a female chief justice. We have heads of what we call parastatals who are women. Again, it stands out because we've never had. Now, imagine a country like, say, Estonia, which has a president who is female, a prime minister who is female. For them, this wonder that we have wouldn't be such a big thing. Why? Because somewhere along the line in the processes of going about norms that they find acceptable to live with, they have long understood and accepted that meritocracy is the way to go, and gender is of no huge consequence. It may be of consequence, but it may not be the determining factor. What am I saying? I'm saying that sometimes when we have a discussion on gender issues, we must actually get to the heart of the matter and ask ourselves what it is that we're actually discussing. Are we discussing gender issues? Are we discussing significance? Are we discussing individual needs to be significant? Are we discussing the need to embrace change? Are we discussing the possibility and the capacity to have open minds so that we can understand what is good for us? And even if we are discussing it, which forum should dominate that discussion? Is it among people who consider themselves intellectuals, academicians? Is it among people who believe that they're pursuing a certain agenda because they're in civil society? And if you are, how then do you cascade this discussion to the everyday mwananchi, knowing that a country like Kenya is dominated by the bulk of its people living in rural areas, and by living in rural areas are essentially subsistence farmers? The norms that we talk about and the change that we talk about because we believe they will bring about something that is good. But is it possible to carry everyone along with it? As you talk about it and as you want to bring about the change, and if you must, how do you do it? I ask these questions because in order to arrive at a sustainable answer or a response, these questions have to be asked and an answer has to be sought. Because the pursuit of the responses that we're looking for has to begin with asking the right questions. Because in asking the right questions, you will then be able to at least arrive at a semblance of a response that you can consider to be correct. At the heart of the gender discussions in this country is male dominance of females, and the desire to have an equal footing. Now, if you don't see it simply as that, then you'll be discussing everything other than what particularly matters. And when you talk about dominance and you talk about position in a domestic setting, how then does it play out? How do you even out roles? I'm breaking it down to that simple rule because everything that we're going to talk about and everything that we want to talk about regarding culture, regarding a way of life, if you can't break it down to something that you can understand in your everyday life, then it really has no meaning. It just becomes an academic subject. One of the things that I always do, I know the plenary session is, I very rarely talk beyond 10 minutes. And I have just gone beyond the 10 minutes of my talk. I am going to say this as a summarize. The entire spectrum of thinking about culture and the changes therein must be looked at from the perspective of culture as being something that, apart, we use the word dynamic, no, something that we are, as we speak, participating in recreating, not creating, it exists, just recreating it to make it relevant. This gadget that we are using is a cultural gadget because it has become a mode of communication. COVID has ensured that we've introduced it into our everyday life. It has now become normal. Everything that we do has to do with this gadget and the way we are communicating. Look at the way you dress. Look at the way you address yourselves. Look at the way you do your things. You may not know it, but the changes and the talk that you talk about, these are things that you are in the process of participating in recreating. So what will your role be, and how do you see the recreation? How do you want the direction to go? Where do you want to take it? How do you want this evolution to take place? Because with every conversation, with every thinking, you are recreating it. And you are ensuring and making sure that there is change. Is that change sustainable? And is that change a structure on which better things can actually be built?
Thank you so much, Uncle Muga, for those insightful words. I want to start with one question before I open it up to everyone. And having listened to you, Dr. Muga, in terms of, I picked certain critical words around warfare, domination by others, and human survival. And I also want to really circle it back to the question around that concrete wall of resistance. And how do we move and shift from that space where, if we want to change perhaps a negative rhetoric or a negative cultural perspective that has been there, how do we shift culture? Uncle Muga, tell us about that concrete wall of resistance.
As I said, the resistance is not to a concept, but to change. And it didn't begin with circumcision. No. It began with accepting that HIV existed. You see, in the early days of HIV, people who were known to be HIV positive were known because they were emaciated. You could find skin hanging on bone, literally, and eyes popping out, clear white. That was the figure, that was the image of somebody who was HIV positive. And people had an explanation for it. In Uganda, they called it slim because people reduced weight. In the part of Lua Nyanza where I was working, and people called it chira, they said, no, this is some curse of something or the other. That was the explanation. And humankind has never lacked explanations for things they don't understand. If there's something that you can't comprehend and you don't grasp, what you do is you throw it into the spirit world and you explain it in spiritual terms. What we did was to try and understand why it is people were resisting it. I had mentioned this in my talk that if you want someone to explain something to you, please ask them and let them explain it to you. So we asked questions. We started working among fisherfolk, because the prevalence of HIV was really high among fisherfolk. And with Professor Bukusi, Dr. Zachary Kwena, Norton Sang, Charity Maingi, and others, we did a lot of work among fishermen and fisherfolk to try and understand their way of doing things and how it is. And in so trying to find out, we got to understand why it was that HIV was so prevalent among them. Because one of the things that you found among fishermen was people had multiple sexual partners. So this sex network that was at the fulcrum of spreading HIV was found very intensely among the fisherfolk. Now, once you understood this, then there was a question of understanding. You began with something that they all understood and was easier for them to relate to, something like sexually transmitted illnesses. That was the concept that you brought in when you discussed HIV. Now, everything else now revolved around making sure that you talk about it from every aspect, social, religious, community, every. We brought in religious leaders. We brought in youth groups, any grouping of people that we could talk to, so that they would tell us their thinking and would explain to them. It wasn't, this is it, do this. No. We knew that was never going to work. When you work in research, one of the things that you find that if you do not do any formative work in whatever it is you're doing, especially if it's a clinical trial, it's going to fail. Not it might fail, it will fail. Because you will be implementing something and you have no clue who it is you're implementing it to and what their response is going to be. Now, Tabitha, you ventured into the realm of what you call behavior change intervention. Now, to change people's behavior, you have to change the way they think. Because what we see you doing is a fact of how you think, really. we had to understand, we had to get people to understand not just what we did, but we got people who are HIV positive to be our champions. Because when somebody who's HIV positive and had been considered dead and has been put on ARVs and they come alive and they're well, if they are the people who as peer leaders start talking to others, it becomes easier for people to accept because the community already knew. And so the subject of stigma, which was at the heart of it, is also dealt with because this is someone who's telling you, self-declaring that I am HIV positive, and these are the drugs I'm taking, and this is what I'm doing. In short, I'm saying a multi-pronged approach had to be used over a long period of time. And stigma was not done away with, but was just reduced significantly.
I'm not going to occupy the space, and I'm not going to ask any more questions around what you mean by a long period of time, because that will be perhaps our parting shot. I'm very interested in getting your understanding, both you and Professor Ngwena, around how long does it take to change culture. But for now, let me go to the questions that have been asked. Professor Ngwena, there is a question from Nerima, who asks around what you spoke of earlier. You had mentioned around the legacy of colonialism, as much more, perhaps even more than our racial component. And she asks a question around, does our shared history of colonization and oppression give us an African identity? And if so, how do we utilize this within the context of nation state?
Yes, thank you very much. I think that the question can be answered in a number of ways, depending on the dimension that is at issue. If we think of the African Union, for example, it is a constellation of states which are found in the cartography called Africa. And that cartography comes straight from Berlin in 1884. All those countries, you will find that they are not necessarily the same, but they have something in common, which allows them, in the first place, to think about becoming members of the Organization of African Unity, which then transformed into the African Union. And if you look at the preamble, and you will find those preambles speak to the colonial history. They speak to the subjugation of Africa. So it was possible for Arab-speaking countries, English-speaking countries, Swahili-speaking countries to come under one umbrella called Africa. And that makes the point that there was nothing linguistically similar when you look at the formation of Africa. Then within Africa, you don't want to be too simple as to overlook that there are regions within it. So if you look at the northern part of Africa, the very northern part, we identified also as Arab Africa in recognition of the linguistic similarity among the countries that make up the Maghreb. And if we look at sub-Saharan Africa, things are a little bit more complex because we don't have a similarity of language. We tend to, I think, coalesce around race a lot. And that racial formation also comes straight from our colonial history, because you were treated the same because you looked similar. So you would be enslaved at some point. And if you were not enslaved, you would have been colonized. And if you were colonized, you would have been categorized socially under those systems in a way that you were at the very bottom of the social strata. But we can look at religion. You will find that there are countries in sub-Saharan Africa that have very close ties with countries in the Arab North because of religion. You find very close link between certain West African countries and the Middle African countries and the Arab countries. So once again, I'm reluctant to simplify. I would want to be comfortable with the idea of Africa being a complex formation, but within that complex formation, we have areas of confluence, we have areas of common interests that bring us together. The very fact that when it comes to trade, Africa occupies, if you like, the lowest position, means also that Africans come together. And probably they also come together with similar parts of the world that are not as preferred by the global north to form a common bond. So these alliances are ongoing at any given point in time, and race can't be the only explanation. The explanation is something much more than that.
I have a second question, Dr. Muga. This comes from Nancy Baraza, who asks, in the context that we're in, and cultural African culture and the impact of African culture on young women, how do they voice their issues without appearing disrespectful?
You know, Tabitha, what I'm actually trying to get Nancy to understand is that we all perfectly well know how to say what and when. When you are in class, if you're a student, you know precisely what you ought to say and how you ought to go about your business. When you're with your female friends, you know what you, meaning we have a fairly clear stratification of how we conduct ourselves when we relate to different people. Now, her question is to specifically to older people. How do I address myself to older people? Now, if you have a father, because I think the issue is not how talking to your mother doesn't seem to be an issue, it's the father. The question would be, what sort of person is your father? Is he a traditional person? Is he the sort of person who expects you to maybe book an appointment to talk to him a week in advance before you can actually, and give him a list of the questions you want to ask him before he actually sees it? Or is he the sort of person who allows you to speak your mind openly? Or are we now talking about a generic situation where, okay, there's this idea that older people should be talked to in this way and the other? I am a teacher. Now, teachers know and understand that the only way you teach well is if you allow your students to speak their mind and to speak to you as they see fit. Now, Nancy, the best way of resolving this problem is, if you are unsure, ask the question. You heard me say it at the very beginning. Dad, I'd like to talk about this. What is the best way of addressing it? You can't really go wrong if you ask that question, can you?
Okay.
And let them guide you and tell you, okay, this is how I'd like you, because you then put them on the spot really, because once they've told you or given you the leeway, you can then say, but I asked you and this is what you told me, so I cannot be considered to be rude. And in asking, you will have shown that you're not being rude. You are actually seeking for guidance. Professor Ngwena, what do you think? Because
I wonder what I think I would answer it in the same way. I think each family is different, so you have to look at the temperament of your parents.
Yes.
You have to be a bit of a psychologist to know what works for them.
Beyond being parents, what about the spaces that are generally occupied by decision makers who are not our age mates?
When you want to talk to someone and you want the communication to be private, you use Signal, okay? And you know this. You use WhatsApp. If you want to call someone and you know that the system is encrypted, you will use WhatsApp and you'll call them. These are responses we know. If you really want to communicate to someone, you will find the best way. The best method usually is, who can I talk to? Who can talk to this person well? It's something that mankind has used from time immemorial. As children, we would talk to our mother if there was something we wanted from our father, because we knew she knew exactly what to tell him. I don't think that mode of communication has changed since. It's just a question. And even if you have many children, in our time, were many children, there was always a child who could tell the parents anything. That's the child whom everybody went to say, look, go and tell them this, go and tell them the other. Because they knew that person would be listened to. What am I saying? There are always means and ways of communication. If you want to look for them, you will find them.
Dr. Muga, I think that we have elicited like a war on the chats because everybody's now asking, why should I go through anybody else to talk? And Catherine has gotten that fire saying, why should we talk through somebody else? And someone else is saying, growing up, Joy says, when I was asked a difficult question, I was asked not to ask silly questions, right? But let me shift away from the conversation on how we engage with these intergenerational barriers that seem to be breaking communication between us. Professor Ngwena, there's a question around the origin of domination, particularly, was it natural for men to be the ones who made decisions, or where do people like Wangua Makere and other female decision makers, where were they, and where did the domination of the male species start happening in terms of decision making?
Yes, it might be a difficult question for me to answer without really going into anthropological studies to look at formation of social groups. But I think without even needing to be an expert, we can all agree on one proposition, which is that societies are not pre-social, which is to say, there was no social code before society was formed. The social codes we have are formed by society, through society, which means that society makes the rules. Now, that is, of course, simplistic because society is always stratified. There are always different permutations of society. Some voices are heard more than others, even in the most democratic country. Nonetheless, you are able to say that some groups have more influence than others. And we can agree, simply by looking at empirical evidence, that male voices have historically prevailed over female voices. How do we know? We simply look at how societies have been formed, how wars were waged, how colonialism was brought to Africa. If you look at the instruments that brought those institutions, they were essentially men. The women followed. So there is enough empirical evidence to establish the dominance of men. But what we shouldn't say is that men are naturally dominant. They're only dominant by creating structures that enhance their dominance. So part of what we try and do, and this is a lifelong project, we contest that dominance through various efforts. Sometimes we have public interest litigation to contest that dominance. Sometimes we do it through the Constitution. That's what Kenya tried to do in 2010, to revisit constitution making to ensure that different groups and societies were equitably represented, and in particular to reverse gender inequality. So we have a number of ways of contesting dominance, and whether they are successful or not, nonetheless, we have a number of instruments at our disposal.
I want to throw just one last question to Dr. Muga, a question from Betty, who says that the example you gave, Dr. Muga, around women, land, and inheritance, and the practices of even just widow inheritance, was that the intention has always been that culture was designed to protect, to offer safety, to offer dignity, right? But what safety or dignity or protection was a practice such as FGM? If you could unpack for us your understanding of female genital mutilation and whether there was really any intention of offering safety, dignity, and protection of the girl child in that.
A lot of what had to do with female genital mutilation was a demonstration of what Professor Ngwena has referred to as male dominance and the pursuit of it. Men went to war, men left homes. And in many cases, there were no aeroplanes, there were no bullet trains, so people would be away for certain lengths of time. In some communities, when they came back, they found that the women they had left had, should we say, bequeathed them further gifts of more children whom they know very well they hadn't sired because they weren't there. So a culture among many communities arose where the female genital mutilation had to do with some really gruesome activities around the female genitalia. Now, some of them have continued to date without any logical reason beyond that of dominance. And it's reprehensible, and it's something that, no matter how you describe it, you cannot find adverse words that can describe it adequately. It's an outmoded tradition that should have been done away with a long time ago. And perpetrators of it should actually have the full force of the law thrown at them. Now, why conversations like this then become important is because you then say these things as they actually are. Culture, by its very nature, is conducted and evolves around human beings, and human beings will bring their own individual twists and turns into issues. So something that was intended for good at some point or the other, and this is what happens with culture. You'll find others have used it for their own ends and for their own good. And a lot of the negative things we see in our so-called African culture has to do with the negativity. There are very many positive things people talk about African culture, but it's the ones we consider that have negative impact and the ones that we find don't really have any positive thing to speak about. Those are the ones we speak about.
Thank you for that, Dr. Muga. One last question for Professor Ngwena, and this is actually dovetailing with what Dr. Muga has said around that we are always focusing on the negative, and as a result of that, could you just give us one last example, and this is a question I think coming from Suleiman, around when we talk about sexual and reproductive rights, are there any positive cultural practices that we could give as examples of spaces where women have actually been protected by culture?
Yes, I think that I would want to agree with Professor that in fact, what we have are examples of harmful practices. And they tend to be typologies of African culture when in fact they are aberrations of African culture. So if we leave them aside, surely there is so much to celebrate about Africa. For example, it is one of the most tolerant regions in terms of religion. We do respect each other's religions. We do not persecute others for believing in the Quran or believing in the Bible or believing in their indigenous beliefs. So I think there is just a lot to celebrate. The very fact that the majority of sexual interactions are consensual rather than a result of rape is a celebration of culture because rape is an aberration of African culture. Sexual violence is an aberration of African culture. So normatively, I think that we have a lot to celebrate. The very fact that we respect that when you marry, you do it voluntarily rather than coerced is a celebration of culture, but it does not follow that there are no aberrations. It does not follow that there are no parts of the African region where young girls are coerced into marriage. So yes, there are challenges that we need to address, but at the same time, we are not a dysfunctional continent. There is just so much to celebrate about African humanity, how empathic we are historically, and how communalistic we are. These are positive values about African culture, but very often I think that when we have instances of violence, but also because poverty is endemic on the African continent, we tend to obviously magnify what is negative, not to say that we should minimize, but a sense of proportion is also important.
Thank you so much. I want to close this, and by closing it, I just want to thank the two of you. Both of you have been wonderful panelists, and you have been extremely engaging in giving critical issues and unpacking them with, an hour and a half is not enough for us to go back, as Dr. Muga said, into the history of FGM and unpack it, into the history of pre-colonial times and unpack it. But you did justice with the little time that you had. Thank you so much to both of you for giving us the chance to tap into the wisdom that you have. And to our lovely participants, thank you so much for all the chats. I did a lot of injustice to your questions because we were really not doing well on time. But I do hope that one of the things that you can do, that for any of you who is interested in having discussions or unpacking one singular issue on FGM, on surrogacy, on intersex persons, we're more than happy to link you to both of the panelists who are here. All right. And thank you so much to everyone who came here. And I think the parting shot for this discussions is, in the words of Professor Ngwena, we keep contesting the dominance. We keep contesting the warfare that has now been laid on women's bodies. We keep contesting the dominance by patriarchy, and never lose hope in the fight, even if it is a lifetime for us to go. Thank you so much. Have a lovely day.